April 11th, 2026. Just past 2 in the morning. The Gulf of Finland is black glass under a thin moon. At the Ust-Luga oil terminal on Russia's Baltic coast, a night shift dispatcher named Andrei is drinking his third cup of tea. He has worked this pier for 6 years. He has never once had to think about air defense. Ust-Luga is 900 kilometers from the nearest Ukrainian position. Every planning document he has ever seen calls it unreachable. Andrei's shift log for that night, later obtained by a regional journalist, shows nothing unusual until 02:11. Routine temperature readings, a note about a delayed rail delivery, the ordinary paperwork of a facility that had spent 6 years being boring by design. That was the point of Ust-Luga's location. Boring was safe. At 02:14, the sky over Pier 3 turns orange. A fireball rolls off the primary distillation unit and climbs 40 meters into the dark. 2 loaded tankers at the berth are burning within 90 seconds. Alarms that were built for a leak, not an air raid, start screaming across a facility that has no bunkers, no shelters, and no plan for this. 900 kilometers away, in a converted classroom outside Kyiv, a Ukrainian operator, known only by the call sign Albatross, watches a thermal feed go white with heat bloom and says one word into his headset: confirmed. This video is the first detailed account of how that fireball got there, not the official press release, not the Kremlin's version, which changed twice in 12 hours, the actual route, because the drones that hit Ust-Luga did not come in the way Russian planners expected. And the reason they went undetected has nothing to do with luck. It has to do with a gap the Russians left open themselves and never told anyone about. Ust-Luga is not a small target. It is the largest oil and gas products export hub on Russia's Baltic coast, a sprawling complex of storage tanks, rail sidings, and deep-water berths built specifically to move sanctioned crude and refined fuel out from under Western eyes. Since 2022, tankers loaded here have carried Russian diesel and naphtha to buyers in Asia, the Middle East, and, through a maze of ship-to-ship transfers, occasionally back into European markets that were never supposed to touch it again. Analysts at the Kyiv School of Economics estimated in late 2025 that Ust-Luga alone handled close to 2 million tons of petroleum products a month. At prevailing prices, that put roughly $180 million a day moving through those berths on a good week. Moscow did not build a backup for that kind of money. It built Pantsir batteries, 3 of them positioned in a triangle around the tank farm, each with a job to intercept anything flying low and slow from the south or east, the directions Ukrainian strikes had always come from. A Nebo-M radar station sat 11 kilometers inland, sweeping the approaches that mattered. On paper, Ust-Luga was covered. One of the 3 Pantsir crews, stationed on the eastern edge of the tank farm, later told investigators, in an account that surfaced through a leaked internal incident report, that an operator had in fact logged an unidentified low-altitude contact at 0152, 22 minutes before impact. The contact was classified as a flock of birds crossing the radar's outer detection ring and dismissed without escalation. No second look, no handoff to the Nebo-M station 11 kilometers inland. It was the kind of call an operator makes 100 times a year and is right about 99 of them. The paper was wrong. The first thing you have to understand about this operation is the aircraft that made it possible. The Lyutyi, Ukrainian for fierce, is not a modified hobbyist drone stitched together in a garage, the way the earliest FPV strikes were. It is a purpose-built, propeller-driven strike aircraft, roughly the size of a small car, developed inside Ukraine's defense industry beginning in 2023. Its listed range, according to Ukrainian officials, who have spoken about it publicly, sits somewhere north of 1,000 kilometers, though the exact figure is one of the most closely guarded numbers in the war. Its warhead runs close to 50 kilograms. Its unit cost, by the estimates that have leaked out, lands around $300,000, a fraction of the cruise missiles it is functionally replacing. What makes it dangerous is not the payload, it is the flight profile. Low, slow, small, and, critically, able to be routed around known threats rather than through them. That routing is where Ust-Luga's planners made their mistake. For most of 2025, Ukrainian long-range strikes on Baltic and Black Sea infrastructure followed a predictable geometry. Drones flew the shortest line from Ukrainian-controlled airspace to the target, which meant crossing Russian territory over land through the exact air defense corridors Moscow had spent 3 years reinforcing. Ust-Luga's planners assumed the same logic would apply to them, if anyone ever tried. They built their Pantsir triangle to watch the land approaches. The one direction nobody reinforced was the sea. That is the detail that stuck with me the most while going through this. Not the drones, not the distance. The fact that a facility built to move oil across open water spent 3 years assuming water was the safe side. According to route data that surfaced afterward through Ukrainian military channels and was cross-referenced against Estonian and Finnish coastal radar logs, the strike package did not approach from the south at all. It looped north and west, out over the open Gulf of Finland, flying low enough to sit under most coastal radar horizons, threading a corridor barely wider than the strait itself between Russian and Estonian territorial waters. It was, in effect, a deception built into the geography. The drones did not sneak past Russian defenses. They went around the side those defenses were never told to watch. The obstacle came almost immediately. Weather over the Gulf in early April is unstable, and on the night of the operation, a low bank of sea fog rolled in around 01 o'clock, thick enough that visual confirmation of the coastline would have been impossible for a standard optical seeker. Ukrainian planners had built the mission around visual waypoint checks along the Estonian shoreline. The fog erased them. The fix was not elegant. It was fast. Operators shifted the terminal approach to thermal imaging, using the heat signature of Ust-Luga's own storage tanks, warmed by weeks of steady throughput, as the final waypoint instead of a visual coastline marker. The port's own infrastructure became the beacon that guided the strike home. 14 Lyutyi drones launched that night, by the count, later reconstructed from wreckage and intercepted communications. 11 crossed into Russian-controlled airspace over the water. 7 reached weapons release over the terminal itself. Recovery teams working with Estonian Coast Guard patrols later found debris consistent with at least 2 Lyutyi airframes washed up along a 9-kilometer stretch of shoreline near Vindloo Island. Wreckage that was quietly catalogued rather than publicized, since neither government wanted to confirm the exact corridor the drones had used. The debris told its own story. Scorched propeller housings, waterlogged guidance modules, the ordinary wreckage of machines that had done their job and simply run out of fuel on the way home. I spent hours going through the timeline, the way it's been pieced together since, and one detail kept nagging at me. The gap between the first drone crossing into Russian airspace and the first impact at Ust-Luga was just under 3 hours. 3 hours of a slow, quiet aircraft crawling across open water at maybe 150 kilometers an hour, with nothing but a compass heading and a thermal signature waiting at the far end. No fighter escort, no backup plan if a single Pantsir crew happened to glance the right direction at the right moment. That's the part that doesn't sit right with most people who first hear about this kind of strike. It sounds almost too simple. Fly around the defenses instead of through them. But simple is not the same as easy. And for 3 hours, 7 aircraft flew in silence toward a target that had never once considered they were coming from that direction. The mission nearly ended before it began. Ukrainian signals intelligence had identified a Russian coastal patrol vessel, call sign unclear in open reporting, that ran a fixed rotation along the Gulf shipping lanes every 6 hours. Planners needed a window when that vessel was at the far end of its route, its own radar looking the wrong way, missed that window, and the whole corridor closed. They found their gap. The drones launched into it. What came next was not the story anyone expected. It was the story of what almost went wrong, and very nearly did. Ust-Luga was not the first target Ukraine attempted using this route. Ukrainian defense sources have since confirmed, in background conversations with journalists at outlets including the Kyiv Independent, that at least one earlier attempt targeting a different Baltic facility in February 2026 was aborted mid-flight after a guidance module on the lead aircraft began drifting off course roughly 200 kilometers into the transit, a fault later traced to a software conflict between the drone's inertial navigation system and its satellite positioning unit operating over open water, far from any terrestrial reference point it had been calibrated against. Engineers spent 6 weeks rewriting the navigation stack, adding a redundant inertial reference specifically tuned for long stretches without land beneath the flight path. Without that fix, the Ust-Luga mission does not happen. The drones simply would have wandered off course somewhere over the Gulf and ditched into the water, or worse, into Estonian or Finnish territory, an outcome that would have turned a strike on Russian oil infrastructure into a diplomatic crisis with 2 NATO members. Here's what this tells us about the broader shape of this war. Every one of these strikes that looks effortless on the night it happens is actually the visible tip of months of quiet failure that never makes the news. Ust-Luga worked because a February mission over a different stretch of the same sea did not, and someone was willing to spend 6 weeks fixing a guidance fault instead of scrapping the whole concept. Put yourself in the shoes of the engineer who had to explain that failure. A $300,000 aircraft, gone, wandered off course into the Baltic on a mission nobody outside a small circle even knew existed. No public credit if you fix it. Real consequences if you don't try again. At 0214, 7 years of assumptions at Ust-Luga stopped mattering. The lead aircraft struck the primary distillation feed, designated internally at the complex as AT-3, the unit responsible for the first stage separation of crude into its component fractions before the lighter products moved on to storage. A hit there does not just destroy equipment. It stops the entire downstream chain because nothing downstream has anything to process. The second and third strikes landed against Pier 3, where 2 tankers sat mid-loading. Port records later reviewed by maritime tracking analysts identified them only by flag and approximate tonnage, roughly 45,000 tons each, part of the so-called shadow fleet of aging, opaquely owned vessels that have carried the bulk of Russia's sanctioned oil exports since 2022. Both caught fire within minutes of impact. Russian firefighting crews at the complex, according to intercepted radio traffic, later summarized by Ukrainian military intelligence, took 11 minutes to reach the pier, hampered by the same access roads that made the facility efficient for cargo and useless for emergency response. By the time hoses were on the fire, the distillation unit was already a total loss. The captain leading that crew, identified in later reporting only by his first name, Victor, had spent 19 years responding to industrial fires at the complex, spill fires, electrical faults, the occasional welding accident. He had trained for exactly none of what he found that night. 2 tankers burning simultaneously, access roads clogged with confused security personnel, and no protocol on the shelf for an airstrike. He later told colleagues the hardest part wasn't the flames. It was realizing, in real time, that the emergency plan he'd drilled his whole career didn't have a page for this. For a few minutes, it looked like that would be the whole story. 2 tankers burning, 1 unit destroyed, a bad night for Rosneft's export numbers. Then the smoke column reached 4 kilometers into the sky, and residents 40 kilometers away, across the water in Narva-Jõesuu, Estonia, started posting photographs of an orange glow on the horizon before Russian state media had said a single word about what happened. That is when the story stopped being about one port and started being about whether any Russian export facility could still call itself safe. Here's the take that will probably get us some pushback. Ust-Luga's planners were not unlucky. They were negligent in a very specific, very avoidable way. Every serious military planner knows that a coastline is not a wall, it is a door that happens to be closed most of the time. Building 3 Pantsir batteries to watch the land approach while leaving the entire seaward arc essentially unwatched was not a resource constraint. Russia has spent billions on air defense inside its own borders since 2022. It was a failure of imagination. The same failure that let a $10,000 sea drone cripple a warship worth 200 times as much earlier in this war. Someone at Ust-Luga signed off on a threat assessment that called the sea route implausible. That assessment is the actual reason the port burned. What do you think? Was this a Ukrainian engineering triumph or a Russian planning failure so basic it barely counts as one? Because the honest answer is probably both. And that split is exactly why this strike matters, more than the smoke column suggests. By dawn, Russian emergency services had declared a regional state of alert across Leningrad Oblast's fuel export infrastructure, the first time such a measure had been applied to the Baltic coast rather than to Black Sea or Crimean facilities, which had absorbed the bulk of Ukrainian strikes throughout 2024 and 2025. Rosneft's internal loading schedule for Ust-Luga, later referenced in a Reuters report citing shipping agents in the region, showed a complete halt to new tanker loadings for 96 hours, while damage assessment teams worked the site. 96 hours, at $180 million a day, in projected throughput, comes to roughly $720 million in delayed or diverted export value, though industry analysts caution that figure represents disrupted flow, not permanent loss, since much of the fuel simply queued for later shipment once the pier reopened. Still, for a facility that had never lost a single day of loading to enemy action in 3 years of war, 4 days was a shock the numbers alone don't fully capture. The distillation unit itself was a longer problem. Rebuilding a primary fractionation column is not a matter of days or even weeks. Industry estimates for comparable rebuilds elsewhere in the Russian refining sector, cited in trade publications tracking sanctions-driven repair delays, run 6 to 9 months, complicated further by the fact that several of the specialized components Ust-Luga would need were manufactured by companies that no longer sell to Russia under any circumstances. So here is the question this strike actually answers, the one that mattered more than any single fire. Not whether Ukraine could hit a target 900 kilometers away. It already had, at other facilities, at other distances. The question was whether a Russian planner could point to any single asset in the entire war and say, with confidence, that one is too far, too well defended, too far north for this to reach. Ust-Luga was that asset. It was the answer Moscow's own briefings gave to worried refinery operators closer to the front. After April 11th, that answer stopped existing. Ukrainian officials, speaking on background to Western defense journalists in the days following the strike, described the operation as proof of concept for a wider campaign against what one official called the Shadow Fleet's shoreside infrastructure, the ports and terminals that make sanctioned oil exports possible in the first place, rather than chasing individual tankers once they are already at sea. That framing matters, because it reframes the entire purpose of hitting an oil terminal. This was never really about the fire. It was about the message the fire sent to every port director from Ust-Luga to Primorsk to Novorossiysk. Your distance from the front line is not a security guarantee anymore. It is a number that used to comfort people and doesn't anymore. Would you have signed off on a threat assessment that called a 900-kilometer sea approach implausible, knowing what this war has already proven about range and improvisation? It's an easy question to answer with hindsight. It was apparently a much harder one to get right in real time, sitting in a briefing room in Leningrad Oblast in early 2025, looking at a map that made the whole idea seem absurd. There is one more piece of this, that the official Ukrainian statements have been careful not to confirm or deny. Multiple maritime security analysts, reviewing satellite imagery from the days before the strike, noted that the Russian patrol vessel whose rotation created the operational window had altered its schedule twice in the preceding 2 weeks, in ways that do not obviously match routine maintenance or crew rotation. Whether that pattern was coincidence, or whether it reflects something closer to human intelligence, feeding the mission planner's exact timing, remains unconfirmed. Ukrainian military intelligence has, characteristically, said nothing at all. What isn't in dispute is the aftermath across the wider Baltic export network. Within a week of the Ust-Luga strike, at least 2 other Russian fuel terminals along the same coastline, according to shipping industry sources, tracking insurance premiums in the region, saw a sudden spike in war risk insurance rates for vessels calling at their berths, a market signal that underwriters no longer considered the northern approach a safe assumption either. Lloyd's List Intelligence, a maritime data provider that tracks exactly this kind of premium movement, reported war risk surcharges for Baltic calling tankers, rising by what brokers described as a low double-digit percentage within 10 days of the strike, a change with real financial weight, given that hundreds of shadow fleet voyages move through that corridor every month. That is the actual legacy of this single night, not the smoke, which cleared within 72 hours, not even the $720 million in disrupted throughput, which Rosneft absorbed the way it has absorbed every other loss since 2022. The legacy is a permanent, unrecoverable increase in the cost of doing what Ust-Luga was built to do, because every insurer, every shipping agent, and every port director on that coast now has to price in a threat that used to be theoretical. Andrei, the night dispatcher who watched the sky turn orange at 02:14, was interviewed anonymously by a regional outlet roughly a week after the strike. He said the thing that stayed with him wasn't the fire itself. It was standing on the pier the next morning, looking north across the water toward Estonia, and realizing that for the first time in 6 years, the empty horizon didn't feel empty at all. Ust-Luga was supposed to be the port that proved distance was still a defense. Instead, it proved the opposite, and every Russian export terminal from the Gulf of Finland to the Sea of Japan is now operating on the same 900-kilometer assumption that just burned to the waterline on a pier outside St. Petersburg. Will Russia's remaining Baltic terminals hold up under the same kind of scrutiny, or is Ust-Luga just the first domino in a longer chain? Comment yes if you think the Shadow Fleet's shore infrastructure is about to become the next major front in this war, or no if you think this stays a one-off. If you want the full breakdown of how Ukraine's deep strike drone program evolved from garage-built FPVs to aircraft like the Lyutyi capable of this kind of range, we've got that story covered in another video on this channel. And it's the piece that makes everything you just watched make even more sense. Subscribe for the next investigation, because the Baltic coast is not done burning yet.